my house here, actually only a couple blocks, and I found a most extraordinary book. It is called The Prisoner of War. It was published in 1865, directly after the Civil War, and it was written by Lieutenant A.C. Roach, who had fought on the Union side and ended up in a number of prisoner of war camps in the South, and the nightmares that the Union men had to endure. So I'm going to do a reading of this book for you, not all in one session, obviously, because it's rather lengthy, but it's extremely interesting and it's extremely historically important, especially today, because today society is such that if you're somebody of my background, I don't want to say the words because I don't want to get, anybody pissed off, excuse me, but my background, you're evil, you're bad, you're just no good. You're the problem of the whole world. Yet, when the Civil War was fought, it was people of my background from the North that went and fought for the freedom of those that today think were worthless. So having said that, I'll say no more about that. It's just that I think that the Union soldiers and their descendants deserve some respect, and we don't get it. At any rate, I said this book was published in 1865. It was first bought, and I can't make out the person's name, unfortunately, but it was first bought on April 17th, 1866. And as I said, the title is The Prisoner of War and How Treated, and containing a history of Colonel Straight's expedition to the rear of Bragg's army in the spring of 1863, and a correct account of the treatment and condition of the Union prisoners of war in the rebel prisons of the South in 1863 to 64, being the actual experience of a Union officer during 22 months' imprisonment in rebellion, with personal adventures, biographical sketches, and history of the Andersonville prison pen. So I'm going to read to you first from the preface by the author. The preparation of this work was first contemplated and partly executed while I was confined in the rebel prison of the South, and with the intention of publishing it immediately after my release or escape from captivity. But the sudden collapse of the military power of the people arrayed in armed rebellion against the government, following soon thereafter, at first determined me to forego the publication of the work, and which I conceived might possibly tend to keep alive the embers of discord between us and our southern foes, and as far as in me lie, consign to oblivion the memory of the wicked deeds, and forget the sufferings and the wrongs of myself and my fellow captives. Subsequent events, however, have shown that our late enemies are not possessed of the same spirit of kindly feelings of friendship that we have extended to them. Moreover, that the leaders among them, under the dissembling guise of repentance, sought the pardon and confidence of the nation which by force of arms, in 4 years of bloody war, they failed to dismember, that they might, with the wily arts of the politician, accomplish its destruction. Believing that subserviency to the demands of those lately leading the armed host arrayed against us by the slave oligarchy, and the wholesale and indiscriminate pardon extended them by our chief magistrate, will at no distant day render fruitless the glorious work accomplished by our noble armies, and vain the gallant deeds and heroic sufferings of the brave men of whom they were composed. I send forth to the public this volume, which, without pretensions to literary merit, breathes the dying moans and starving wails of 20,000 Union soldiers whose shroudless and uncoffined bodies molder beneath the soil, beneath the sod adjacent to the rebel prisons in which they were tortured to death. Trusting that whatever influences it may exercise will aid in bringing the guilty leaders of treason to just punishment for their enormous crimes against humanity. And without any aspirations whatever to the literary notoriety, I have endeavored to give a plain, unvarnished narrative of facts and incidents of prison life as they occurred under my own observation. During 22 months in various rebel prisons, I have added also the statements of several other Union prisoners who stand ready to vouch for the same with their affidavits. In this recital, of the terrible woe of our soldiers who were prisoners of war, I do not wish to be understood that I charge the mass of the Southern people with complacency in the inhuman treatment they received. Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and other rebels high in authority, and the monsters whom they placed in immediate command of the prisoners, are alone responsible, and on their heads let just and condign punishment fall. Let's say one more thing before I move on to chapter 1. I heard a speech the other day by our president, Biden, and where he compared the situation in our country today as being the most divisive and dangerous since the Civil War. If you go through this whole book with me and can agree with that, then I don't know what to say. But what we face right now in our country is indeed very precarious. Absolutely. But we have not seen anything yet like what these Union soldiers saw in the Civil War. Having said that, let's go on with chapter 1, which is titled simply Introductory Remarks. When new arrivals of unfortunate prisoners were ushered into the gloomy precincts of the various rebel prisons of the South by the brutal and inhuman officials in charge, they were almost invariably addressed by the old inhabitants with the simple but important interrogatory, where were you captured? Consequently, knowing the propensity of my old comrades and fellow prisoners to learn where and how each individual prisoner was gobbled, I shall, in first place, although it does not properly belong to the original design of our history of prison life, give a sketch of Colonel Straight's expedition to Georgia in the spring of 1863, when it will be recollected his entire command, consisting of about 1,200 men and 100 officers, were made prisoners of war and charged with such heinous crimes by the then exultant and seemingly triumphant and successful rebels that their authorities refused to exchange us on any terms whatsoever. This action of the rebel officials at once put a stop to the workings of the cartel arranged months previous for the immediate exchange of all prisoners of war. As soon as practicable after their capture, this then being the beginning of that premeditated and systematic plan of inhuman treatment, starvation, and murder practiced by the rebel authorities during the last 2 years of the war on Union soldiers who fell into their hands, and I trust a sufficient apology for introducing into this work. Organization of Straight's expedition. The spring of 1863 opened with the prospect of beginning a season of inactivity for the Army of the Cumberland. The rebel General Bragg, with a large, well-equipped army, occupied near Tullahoma, Tennessee, a strong natural position improved by the ingenuity known to military silence until it was almost impregnable. Consequently, it was not in the program of the cautious and sagacious Rosecrans, then commanding the Army of the Cumberland, to make an advance movement until the command was in condition of health, number, and equipments that certain and decisive victory would be inevitable. These important military items, it was not expected, could be brought about before perhaps the middle of the approaching summer. To the mind of Colonel A.D. Strait, of the 51st Indiana Volunteer Infantry, this term of inaction was a period of ennui and afforded the enemy in his stronghold at Tullahoma a rest and feeling of security that his active and restless spirit could not contemplate. He therefore made application to the commanding general for the independent mounted brigade of command of this description, necessarily affording an opportunity for constant and active service, and would, if directed in the proper manner, draw from the banks of the Cumberland and Ohio the guerrilla bands of Forrest, Morgan, and other noted chieftains in the rebel service, and give them employment in their own boasted land of Dixie. This enterprise of Colonel S. was favorably received by General Rosecrans, and following named troops accordingly placed under his command and designated as the Independent Provisional Brigade. Designed for special secret service, his own regiment, the 51st Indiana, 3rd Ohio, Colonel O.A. Lawson, 73rd Indiana, Colonel Gilbert Hathaway, and 8th and 80th Illinois, Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Rogers, commanding, and companies D and E of the 1st Middle Tennessee Cavalry, commanded by Captain D.D. Smith. Active preparations were at once commenced for the expedition to Alabama and Georgia for the purpose of destroying the vast supplies of the rebels and the railroad communication in the interior of those states. On arriving at the city of Nashville, where Colonel Strait was ordered to fit out his command, preparatory to the starting of the expedition, he organized the following staff, to wit: Captain D.L. Wright, 51st Indiana Volunteers, to be AAAG; Major W.L. Peck, 3rd Ohio, to be Brigade Surgeon; Lieutenant J.G. Doherty, Regimental Quartermaster, 51st Indiana Volunteers, to be AAQM; Captain E.M. Driscoll, 3rd Ohio Volunteers, to be AAIG; Lieutenant C.W. Pavey, 80th Illinois Volunteers, to be Brigade Ordnance Officer; and Lieutenant A.C. Roach, 51st Indiana Volunteers, to be ADC. Operations now commenced in earnest, and Colonel Strait and the officers of his staff working day and night to supply the command with the necessary clothing, ordnance, and equipments for the expedition. And at the end of the 3rd day, with the exception of the requisite number of animals to mount, the command, the personal brigade, was thoroughly organized and equipped, officers and men ready and anxious for any duty that they might be called upon to perform. Departure from Nashville. On the afternoon of April 10th, Colonel Strait received orders from General Garfield, Chief of Staff, to embark at once on steamers, then at the landing, and proceed down the river to Palmyra. Everything was speedily put on board and got in readiness for starting. And on the morning of the 11th, from the docks of the transports chartered for our expedition, as they sped irresistibly along before the mighty force of the river's current and power of the steam engine, we took a farewell view of the capital of old Tennessee. And soon the church spires and cupolas, reflecting the beams of the morning sun, were lost to the eye, and the rugged banks of the Cumberland, and the spinal columns of white steam ascending from the existent pipes of the numerous boats composing our fleet, and forming behind us over vale and hill a milky track of the circuitous course of the Cumberland, were the only objects to divert the mind or attract the attention until we arrived at the place which, in the palmy days of peace, was pointed out to the traveler on the now classic waters of the Cumberland as the village of Palmyra, but now only a heap of black and charred ruins, presenting one of the many scenes of devastation that will tell you for years to come that our country was once convulsed with one of the most unnatural and gigantic wars of any age, a war inaugurated by a people whose sole aim and object was to rear an autocratic government on the ruins of the constitutional liberty and human freedoms. The landing at Palmyra. At this place our command disembarked and bivouacked for the night, and early the next morning a detail of 4 companies was placed under the command of Colonel Lawson of the 3rd Ohio Volunteers to accompany our transports, 8 in number, via Smithland and Paducah to Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, where our command was to re-embark. We remained at Palmyra 1 day and a half, during which time every member of the command was actively employed. Those to whom the animals were issued that were furnished us at Nashville, breaking their mules, and the remainder scouring the country through in every direction in quest of animals to put through the same interesting ceremony, during the performance of which the long-eared and stubborn quadruped, before mentioned, would tax his ingenuity and muscular power to the utmost to divest himself of his unwelcome rider. Does bucking bronc come to mind? And as our boys were foot soldiers, they were at first very easily dismounted, frequently in the most undignified and unceremonious manner. One witnessing the performance, and not knowing the boys were breaking mules, would have naturally supposed they belonged to Dan Rice's or Van Amberg's circus and were a company of trained somersaults and tumblers exercising in their profession for amusement, though could they have been close enough to see the numerous bruised heads and sprained limbs, the illusion would have been soon dispelled. But both of these, or even worse injuries, the boys regarded as a bit of trivial consequence And now that so admirable an opportunity for riding presented itself, they were determined to ride at all hazards. It was here that Colonel Strait first discovered the quality of the animals drawn by Quartermaster Doughty at Nashville in his report to Major General Thomas. He speaks concerning them as follows. The mules issued to me at Nashville were nothing but poor, wild, and broken colts, many of them but 2 years old. A large number of them had a horse temper. Some 40 or 50 of the lot were too near dead to travel and had to be left at the landing. And some 10 or 12 died before we even started. Those that were able to travel at all were so wild and unmanageable that it took nearly 2 days to catch and break them, and even then a man saddling one was in imminent danger of life unless he kept a sharp lookout for some heels of the mule, which were most of the time performing evolutions in the air, something after the style of the wild Highland fling. We leave Palmyra. On the 13th of our command, left Palmyra and marched about 15 miles, proceeding by a circuitous route in a southwestern direction, camping at night on Yellow Creek, 14 miles from Fort Donelson. This was our first day's march as mounted infantry, and though as yet only about 1/3 of our men were mounted, but these were considered by the boys a most formidable body of cavalry, and they no doubt imagined themselves mounted and on their suddenly metamorphosized war steeds, mules, successfully charging and putting to flight massed columns of the enemy's infantry, rushing with yells and fixed bayonets to the conflict. Nature had donned her most attractive garb. The warm spring sun had already coaxed the early wildflowers to peep modestly forth and adorn the fields and woods with their bright hues, which seemed to inspire every soldier with hope and courage. The thought of being prisoner in the hands of a merciless and inhuman enemy within a month, or ever for that matter, never once entering their minds. But the fortunes of war are of all things the most variable. Pressing horses and mules. Early the next morning we resumed our march and arrived at Fort Henry about noon on the 15th. We had scoured the country as far south as it was safe on the account of the proximity of a large force of the enemy in that direction under Woodward. It will be remembered that we left Nashville with less than 800 animals, not quite half enough to mount our command, and many of these entirely useless for the kind of service required. And although about 100 of our mules gave out and had to be left behind on our march, yet when we reached Fort Henry our animals numbered about 1,200. Those we had collected in the country were mostly in good condition, but nearly all were barefooted. It may be asked why we were not furnished with sufficient number of good animals before leaving Nashville. For the very good reason that the grand object of the expedition was to cripple the enemy as much as possible, and one very effectual way of doing this was to seize the animals whose labor furnished substance for the rebel armies and roving bands of guerrillas whose dastardly and fiendish deeds have cursed the fairest portions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and border states. General Rosecrans therefore gave orders to Colonel Strait to mount his command in the above manner, and which could very easily have been done had there been 1/3 as much in stock in the country as we expected to find, and had there been 1/10 the number General Morgan found in the course of his expedition through Indiana and Ohio. In the course of his expedition through Indiana and Ohio, we could have marched to the coast of Florida and back in safety, but on the contrary, the line of our expedition afforded but very few animals, and those of an inferior quality. Contrary to our expectations, our transports had not yet arrived at Fort Henry and did not reach there until the evening of the 16th, having been delayed at Paducah, Kentucky, taking on rations and foraging for General Dodge's army at Corinth, Mississippi. The whole of that night, officers and men were actively engaged embarking the animals and in other preparations for our departure from Fort Henry. And on the morning of the 17th, when the sun came out bright and beautiful from behind the hills bordering the waters of the Tennessee, His beams mingled with the spray dashed in the air by the bows of our vessels as they plowed impetuously against the current of the Grand Old River. After a voyage of 3 days made delightful and pleasant by the genial smiles of a southern spring that gave a garb of beauty and grandeur to the towering hills on either side, and a border of green shrubbery and many colored flowers to the meandering Tennessee, we arrived at Eastport, Mississippi at that time, in consequence of low water, the head of navigation on this river. We land at Eastport. Eastport is a steamboat landing in the northeast corner of the state of Mississippi and 8 miles from Iuka, formerly the scene of one of our gallant Rosie's triumphs. At this time, General Dodge, with his Corinth Army, was in camp on the banks of Little Bear Creek, 10 miles distant, awaiting the arrival of our command, and he having received orders to make a demonstration up the Tennessee River, threatening Tuscumbia, Florence, and other points in the valley. For as soon as our command had disembarked and directions had been given for camping, the brigade and caring for the animals, Colonel Strait started for General Dodge's camp, an interview with that officer being necessary to our future movements. And next time we will pick up at heading of disastrous affairs, and we will be getting into some of the prison situations that he found himself in at first. We'll be looking later at the surrender of General Forrest, escape of a dead Yankee, starved to death, Water and Libby, inside view of Libby, the prison camp, many things, and a most fascinating account that took place right here on our United States of America land, the Union defending the freedoms of the slaves in the South. So, until next time, God bless you. I hope that you found this interesting and that you'll come back. I'm hoping to be able to present this to you every Wednesday. God bless.